Are you sitting down?
Thursday.
It's Thursday!
I almost said it's Friday, but it's
Are
not.
we on?
Yeah.
We're on.
Oh,
Beauty.
Donkey Kong.
Beautiful.
Woo-hoo.
Champion.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Oh,
So it's a Thursday, but it's really a Friday for us.
Is it?
it's both.
Oh,
why is
that?
Well, because it's the last day of the week.
It is.
Long weekend. And what a great way to kick off a long weekend. Then with a little bit of whiskey.
You're not wrong.
What about too much whiskey?
Have we got a shot measure somewhere?
Nah, it's a Thursday. Thirsty Thursday.
Okey-doke.
Oh, great.
Beautiful.
I'll go get the shot now.
No, I can manage. We'll manage, Russ.
We've got a Christine on.
Hey,
Hey.
hello, Christine.
Beautiful.
I'll go get the shot, man.
No, Russ.
Christine won't mind. I'll be
We
back
don't
in a minute.
need it, Russ.
No, we do.
Now, so what's so good about American whiskey, Luke?
I'm very excited about American whiskey. So we've had a couple of people ask about American whiskies, particularly rye and Tennessee whiskies.
Yes.
And also because we've done multiple whiskey tastings, and I think 3 of the 4 whiskey tastings have been Scotch whiskey. And I think it's unfair to only talk about Scotch whiskey when we talk about whiskey.
No, you're quite right.
So we thought we'd give a little bit more diversity.
Diversity, yeah.
And after our Whiskies of the World tasting, we thought what would be better to follow that up than a little bit of American whiskey.
No, quite right. We've got Adam here. He's good. G'day, guys. I've been looking forward to this one for a while.
Adam, welcome.
Adam, I think you were an encouragement for us to do this.
Adam was a huge encouragement. One of our private tastings we did with Adam, him and I believe his father
family, yeah,
and his family were very interested in rye whiskey. So
and James.
as a fan of rye whiskey, I'm very glad that we got to where we are doing this tasting.
We've also got Liz in Balaclava, and I believe that she's got Rosemary with her too,
Oh,
and Diane
lovely.
as well.
Woohoo!
Fantastic. Oh, and a Josh. Hey, hey.
Josh
Hey,
is
hey.
on. Love that.
Beautiful. Now, what do you need to know about American whiskey? I don't know anything about American whiskey.
Oh, good.
It comes from America.
Beautiful.
I
So,
no, you should say that. You should say it. But my mate Jerry constructed at the back of his shed what is called a French drain. And did it all successfully and all blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, why is it called a French drain? Thinking it was something dramatically Parisian about it. But it was actually made by an American man whose name was Mr. French.
Mm-hmm.
So the French drain is in fact an American drain made by a man called Mr. French.
Ross, can we talk about whiskey?
Oh, sorry. Just to be completely free. But so American whiskey
Ross.
could be...
Shut up, we're talking about whiskey. Stop talking about drains.
We've got it also Janine here. She go, hello. Comments will be from Kent. Big fan of American whiskey.
Woohoo! I'm so glad Kent's on board.
Awesome.
So, American whiskey. Basically, what's really interesting about whiskey in general is wherever it's from, you've got to understand a lot of the time people make their spirit from what is their already a food product.
Mm.
So, in America, they were growing wheat and barley.
Corn?
And finish.
Okay.
Wheat and barley, because that's what the Scottish and the English had grown, and that's what went into their whiskey. But they discovered that corn actually grew a lot better, and made up a lot of their diet and was very affordable.
Yeah, okay.
So it ended up being a huge part of their whiskey.
Yeah.
So bourbon is traditionally made of 51% corn. To call it
51% corn.
So to call it bourbon, it has to be more than 50% corn.
Yes.
The standard is 51 or more.
Okay.
And there's other things that go into that, like rye, standard wheat, and barley.
Okay.
And for clarification, barley and wheat are very, very similar. Wheat traditionally wasn't used in Scotch whiskey because it was solely used for making flour. And the barley was left over for things like cracked barley, whole grain sort of
Yes.
grains and stuff like that.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Because there was a little bit more left over, it ended up making whiskey.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Sweet.
And
Fantastic.
there's more to bourbon than just that, though. Do you want to go?
we'll get into it.
You going to do it?
So we're going to start with the Woodford Reserve bourbon, and they call it Kentucky Straight.
What does that mean?
So A, it's made in Kentucky.
Yep.
To call it straight whiskey or straight bourbon, it needs to be made. It needs to be aged in.
Next to a ruler.
Yeah.
In America, to call it straight whiskey, it needs to be aged in brand new American oak.
Ah, okay.
And so
And is that why a lot of people age different whiskies and stuff in ex-bourbon barrels?
correct.
Because
It's
there's
gotta
a
be-
lot of them.
It's got to be brand new oak, which means to create bourbon or American whiskies, they have to constantly produce new casks. And
Yeah.
after that, it can't be used to make another bourbon.
Right.
So that's why you see a lot of Scotch these days finished in bourbon barrels, because they're producing more than anyone else.
Yeah, okay. Alright, there you go. Stunning from Woodford Reserve. Now we've got Ian who said, good evening, not drinking, just listening.
Hello,
Right,
Ian.
in South Australia.
So it smells to me a lot like bourbon.
This is one of my
Descriptive, wow.
this is one of my favourite
It's got
bourbons.
that bourbon smell of it.
Oh.
Um,
It's lots of vanilla, like a lot of vanilla, a bit of honey.
Yeah.
Vanilla is very common, spoken about in
But that comes
American
from the
whiskey,
American oak barrels.
which
did you?
comes predominantly from American oak. Also, people talk about toasty caramel flavors. That's because they toast their barrels. So they take brand new oak and they char it. So previously what they've done is they make the barrel without one end cap and they put it over a flame
Oh.
and char the whole inside. That makes the inside slightly more porous. Gives the alcohol can go in and out of the wood a little bit more freely. It means that you get a lot more flavour in your whiskey. It also it kills off some of that new oak flavour that can be kind of acidic and vegetal, like new woody sort of fresh wood smell, and gives it a little bit more of that rich caramel, vanilla,
The depth, I
a
suppose.
bit more
Yeah,
toasty
okay.
depth to it.
Interesting.
I'm certainly getting caramel.
Christine, we have started with Woodford Reserve Bourbon.
That one.
Okay, so apart from vanilla
There's caramel.
and apart from caramel, let's talk about
I got
actual
a little bit of honey.
honey. I'm getting clove,
Ooh, the spice.
bit of star anise, bit of burnt orange peel.
Ooh, yeah. A little bit citrusy.
Yeah, and it's like that nice rich
Ooh, we
citrusy.
didn't talk about the colour.
Talk about colour.
Quite a goldeny, toasty,
It's a beautiful
caramelly
gold
brown.
colour.
Oh, I'm awake now.
Sorry, Ross has had a long week. Speaking of long weeks,
Luke's had a long week too.
I've had a very long week.
Luke had...
I was not expected to be here for this tasting today because I had my wisdom teeth out the other day. But there's nothing that's going to get me out of bed in the morning like a good whiskey tasting.
Ross and Vivian were saying that like, Luke won't be in tomorrow, it'll just be you and Ross, and I was like, no, I know Luke will be here. Luke will be here.
If there's anything that will get me out of bed and to work, it is a good bit of whiskey.
Christine is getting woody notes and brown sugar.
Brown sugar, yeah.
That's a good one.
There's a nice
Are you getting anything other than bourbon, Ross?
there's some really beautiful
I was getting the caramel and the brown sugar
Oh,
and a bit of the...
with the...
there's almost
I'm getting a bit of star anise now. It's got on my palate.
there's a bright floralness on the
That's
nose.
what I was just thinking. But I don't know what it is.
It's almost, it pairs with that sort of smell of star anise, that where the anise comes from, that bright, a little bit herbal, a little bit floral, a little bit spicy.
What about sort of citrus flowers, something like orange?
No,
Blossom.
it's lighter.
Orange blossom's not far off, actually.
Oh, now I've said it. It's orange blossom, but maybe that's me just
No, you
suggesting.
no, I
Talking
think
yourself
you're
into
suggesting yourself.
Christina said it's really rich and slightly leathery. Hot.
Leather is a good bet. Particularly really freshly cut leather has a really particular smell. When we talk about leather, sometimes we talk about it in wine when it comes to tannins, and that's like old, almost burnt leather. Whereas this is like
Or
a
like-
really...
Or like
Right.
that new wallet kind of smell. But that's... I don't think it smells like a...
No, this is like like a bright, fresh new leather.
New suede shoes.
Yeah, I know that's not the most.
I was almost getting like nutmeg.
Nutmeg's a good bet. I'm trying to work out what that floral smell is though. It's
Almost
almost
like a little bit
elderflowery.
Apple-y. Oh yeah.
Apple blossom.
See, I'm getting.
I don't think apple blossom is what I would say.
Well, I'm going to go into tasting.
It's got bourbon flowers in it.
Ross. Ross is not the biggest fan of bourbon at times because I think he's been fed too many bad bourbons in his life.
Oh, it's quite sweet. I'm not sure what I was expecting from American whiskey, but I always thought it was a little bit sweeter. But
Sweeter than
I guess Scotch.
it tends to be referred to as sweeter. Technically, it doesn't have any more sugar in it.
Yes.
But it's about the flavor profile.
It's all about the barrels and the corn.
Yeah, it's about the flavor profile that comes a lot of the time from the corn.
Okay.
Because it has a slightly oilier, denser, vegetal character to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, there's that little receptor in your brain that is about flavor profiling, where if you taste lots of vanilla, you will inherently
Oh, you think it's sweet?
think it's sweeter
Yeah,
than it
right,
actually is, because you're a lot of the time only tasting vanilla from pastries and caramels and sweet products. And not,
Well, you also just has caramel flavours as well, so you're going straight there.
it doesn't make it sweet, so it's got like a burnt sugar and vanilla taste. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's got more sugar in it.
Yeah.
They're just similar flavors to
Yeah,
what
okay.
we recognise. So that's particularly quite hard for a lot of bourbons, and I think some bourbons are made slightly sweeter depending on how much corn they use and how they make it.
I won't mention any of the big name brands, but there's a few of them actually add caramel to give the colour.
And I was about to say, this is quite a light golden colour.
So if you
These
add
guys-
caramel, get the flavour, you're actually increasing the sugar content.
Part of the reason we chose this particular bourbon whiskey is because it looks a lot lighter than a lot of name brand run-of-the-mill bourbons. And that's not because it's been aged less, it's because it hasn't got colour additives.
Yeah,
So
okay.
this is actually the natural colour of the bourbon.
Lisa says, I get nutmeg. And I think Kent has said, bad bourbon is the best bourbon. And David has said, have you talked about mash bills yet?
I was about to get to that actually.
Oh,
That's getting real complicated.
Anyway, let's finish talking about the flavour on this before we move on, and we'll talk about mash bills in a second.
That's the technical stuff.
No.
Mm.
What are you getting on the palate, Ross? That's not the palate, that's your nose.
Ross. It's interesting. There's a really there's a very interesting note that's coming through from the charcoal, and it's not like that toasted sugar taste. It's that almost acidic, chalky sort of finish. It's hard to describe in a spirit because it's not the texture; it's that flavour at the end.
Do you recommend adding a bit of water to this one?
Let's find out.
Give it a go.
Joe?
Joe. Give it a swirl.
I would say this actually makes a really good old fashioned.
Old fashioned. Yeah, okay, nice. Oh, I much prefer it with a bit of water. I feel like it's not a lot
It's a little bit more.
toastier.
Yeah, there's almost a.
I was thinking the classic toasted marshmallows.
No,
always gets me.
I'm thinking like toasted buttered popcorn.
Oh,
But obviously that's the flavour of the toast and corn
yeah.
coming
That's-
through.
That's slightly
Looking
darker,
for.
almost burnt caramel.
No, I don't think so.
I do.
But I
That's
don't.
just me.
Christina says, I'm getting something almondy actually, like almond pastries.
Oh.
Like almond croissants.
Old school marzipan.
Really?
Yeah, if you
Oh no, I'm not eating marzipan. I don't like marzipan that much.
No, I'm not a fan of
I-
marzipan.
there's a particular like old school like homemade marzipan that has a similar flavour to that, and it's kind of it's
I'd
rough
go
around
more,
the edges.
I'd go more like nougat than marzipan.
Ah, yeah.
Nougat's
Yeah.
a good bet.
Yeah. Yeah, cool.
Actually, new guy's a really good bet. Anyway, shall we
Let's
move
proceed.
Go
on?
Well, now what are we going to do now?
We are moving on to Tennessee whiskey.
Ooh, the George
Dickel.
George Dickel, number 8.
Quite like a bottle of this one as well. The
I
Woodford.
love this bottle. It pours
I'm
really
excited. I haven't
nicely.
had any George Dickel for ages.
And so now we shall move on to the conversation that we mentioned earlier, the sour mash bill.
Mash bill.
Or mash bill. With any whiskey making or spirit making in general, we have, before you distill it, you must make a fermentation. So that creates your first alcohol.
Yep.
Distillation just concentrates all of that alcohol up to 40%.
Or 50%.
Or more.
60%.
Anyway, beside the point. But you have to ferment your original vegetable, fruit, corn, grain, whatever.
Potatoes.
Anything. You've got to ferment it first. And that's done with either natural yeast or added yeast. And much like making a bread, there's a lot of yeast in the air. It can naturally ferment. But the way in which a lot of whiskies are made, like bread, which is adding yeast, a sour mash, or any whiskey that refers to a mash bill, or a sour mash in particular, is made like a sourdough. So you reserve part of the previous fermentation
Yes.
to kickstart the next batch.
Like kombucha.
So much like kombucha or a vinegar mother or a traditional sourdough.
Yeah.
Basically, and the reason this was is because a lot of the time, depending on the weather, your fermentation would not start at the same rate. It might be quite hard to get it started.
Yeah, okay.
Depending on lots of different things. And they realized to get the most consistent flavor was if you built one batch of distillation off the flavor of the previous one, you get a lot of the same yeast creating the same fermentation that comes out of the distillation. And the longer you go on, the more of this flavor levels out and becomes more consistent.
Okay.
So
is that why it's called a sour mash as well? Because of not sourdough, but
yeah, because it's about, and because they keep it from one batch to the next, they don't need to keep a lot because that fermentation gets to a high enough stage to make alcohol.
Yeah.
Then it's kept and it gets more and more sour. So it gets really quite heavily concentrated. They don't need to use a lot to kickstart a fermentation for a whole batch.
Okay.
So it's like a yeast concentrate.
Interesting.
It's really interesting. And
there you go.
depending on how people treat their sour mash and what grains go into it can really heavily change the whiskies.
There you go. So this is the George Dickel.
Wasn't the mash bill also about what percentages of what grains they use?
Not necessarily. So to be called a bourbon, it must be 51% corn.
Yep.
Yeah.
Tennessee whiskey always uses 51% corn and is, technically speaking, could qualify to be bourbon. They've worked really hard to, particularly in Tennessee, to be known for this style of whiskey. And so because of that, they have coined the term Tennessee whiskey. So it does not just mean any whiskey from Tennessee. It means a sour mash whiskey that has been filtered through sugar maple before aging. So sugar maple was named obviously after maple syrup. And the most southern state that it grows in naturally is Tennessee.
Oh.
So it's the most south in America that you can find native sugar maple.
Yeah.
So they distill the product from a sour mash, like you would a bourbon. And then after that, they filter it through sugar maple charcoal or staves, which is like a stick.
Yeah.
So the idea is that they purify the flavour before it gets barrel aged, so that the barrels can do as much flavouring to the whiskey as possible.
Technical terms. Barrel.
Yeah.
And because of that, the heritage that they built around the sugar maple filtration, a lot of people in Tennessee will not make a bourbon whiskey They will go out of their way to make sure that it is Tennessee whiskey.
There you go.
Well,
what do we get? This one is slightly, almost kind of more yellow.
it's got a more yellow tone to it.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes be from the sugar maple.
It's also a fair bit drier.
Yeah. I feel like this one's quite appley.
Mm. Yeah, there's a like bright fresh apple almost.
I'm not getting as much toasty with this one.
There's a little bit more fruit.
Lisa said
Red
very
apples, toffee apples.
yeah.
Yeah.
Lisa said very elegant, and Janine has said no vanilla. Oh, I think this was Ken. No vanilla in that baby.
Yeah.
I'm
There's a
getting
lot less vanilla in here.
stewed fruits on the nose as well, a little bit grassy.
The
Ooh,
grassiness is a good note.
Yeah.
sultanas and stone fruit. Yeah.
The other thing is that that when they filter it through the sugar maple, it is often charred, but it doesn't have to be completely charred.
Yes.
So there's still often, it gets a lot of contact with fresh maple wood. And when we think about maple, we obviously think about maple syrup.
So is that giving those green characteristics, you reckon?
That might be bringing a lot of the green characteristics because it's fresh, really fresh green wood, or can be fresh green wood. But also, that green flavour can be about the mash bill and the fermentation, that yeasty. All of the yeast can bring out things like vegetal flavours.
I'd almost say a bit of cinnamon, but I feel like I'm just getting that because I associate that with apple.
No, it's like really bright cinnamon, not super spicy dark cinnamon. I'm getting a lot of like straw and hay.
Yeah, Christina said grassy, a bit of hay, sort of that.
I find that aroma really like bright and refreshing almost on the nose. It's definitely packed with a lot less vanilla in it.
Yeah, certainly.
And I kind of enjoy that it lets the other flavours breathe a little bit more.
Indeed.
Is anyone else getting any other fruit or floral flavours from this?
Nobody said any floral flavours, just sort of stewed fruit, maybe stone fruit.
I'm getting hints of apricots.
Apricot.
Yeah, it's sort of stone fruits or some dried stone fruits like apricot.
Like dried apricots.
Yeah.
I'm getting honeysuckle, but that might just be
Well, maybe I'm getting apricots, you're getting honeysuckle.
something else, yeah.
Ooh.
It's really interesting whiskey.
I'm going to dive in.
Same. Quick, dive.
Dare I say it, there is a little bit of maple to that
Yeah.
on the palate.
I enjoy the mouthfeel of that one.
The
It's quite nice.
texture is
Very
beautiful.
smooth. Really nice. Ross, you put a keen
The other
thinking
thing,
face there.
I am. It's a nice. Try to draw out what it is.
a lot of the time American whiskies will say straight whiskey, and you'll notice this says straight bourbon and this says straight rye.
Ruler.
It has to be over 40% ABV.
Ah.
This is important because of Australian taxes, and because they tax by unit of alcohol. You'll notice a lot of spirits in Australia have been changed to import strength, which is strong enough to be spirit, but low enough to cost less. So you'll notice things like Smirnoff come in at 37.5 now.
But all of those spirits are like that. Like they used to all be 43%, they're now 42, then they're 41, then they're 40, then they're 39.
So you'll notice things like Jim Beam used to be referred to as straight bourbon whiskey. They can no longer call it straight bourbon whiskey because it's imported at 37.5.
Right.
But no, it's not. It's actually imported a lot higher.
And then gets
Watered down here.
cut.
It can get cut here with water. If you have a look at an Australian bottle of Jim Beam, it says made from local and imported ingredients. Which always I find frightening because what are they doing to it if it's local and imported ingredients?
Yeah.
We're hoping the local ingredient is only water.
So
That's true.
this is why the other reason we picked these whiskies is they are all made and bottled in the US from American ingredients.
Yeah.
None of that crummy Australian water in it.
Well, the other
Never.
thing that's to be said, and this is something that is often brought up in Scotch whiskey, is that you should. So whiskey comes out of the still at a higher ABV than 40% a lot of the time, and is watered down to 40%.
Or 42 or 43.
whatever percentage they want. And a lot of people, particularly in Scotland, say that you should cut your whiskey with the water that makes the grain,
Ah, yes.
which is
Yeah.
really interesting, particularly with things that are imported and then cut down to bottling strength. It is not made with the same water that fed the grain. So you're adding two different flavour profiles from water, which might give you less clarity and less
Interesting.
perfection. But that's a theory that's not necessarily
Yeah. Now I might add some water to this one. Please,
supported.
Luke. No, I didn't ask about the Woodford. Where did you want to be drinking the Woodford?
Oh.
And then I'll ask you where you want to drink this one.
I think the Woodford is
Well, you said an old-fashioned.
like late Friday night and you need an old fashioned, say in autumn, I believe.
Autumnal. Yeah.
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 What about the Dickel?
I haven't decided yet.
That's all right. That's my phone.
Okay. Bit of background noise.
Yeah.
Yeah. What
Background
about
music.
George Dickel?
I haven't decided yet. You might wanna-
Well, I'm thinking the Woodford. I don't know. I don't think it has to be late night necessarily. I'm thinking it'd be at first. Almost. I don't know. I'm just trying to think. Chocolate, something like that.
Yeah, see, I think this is like the first weekend of autumn when it's still nice and warm and you still want to like enjoy the last of the warm nights and have like an old fashioned slightly too late on a Friday night.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what's important. Mind you, this George Dickel, I'm quite happily.
Actually,
drink
that
straight.
water is bringing out the honey notes in this. I think.
Yeah.
Really
I can agree. Kenda says, do the Japanese still import water from Scotland?
Some do and some don't. The problem with that situation was that it was a practice they started when they wanted to get into the Scotch market for selling their whiskey. And then now that their production is a lot larger, some of the companies that got well known for importing Scottish water can't necessarily import enough water for the amount of whiskey they're producing.
Right.
So do they still import it to make their whiskies? Yes. Is it 100% Scottish water in their whiskies? Probably not.
Probably not. Well, there you go.
The question would be then, notably a question of purity, I would have thought. That's why you see a lot of the vodkas particularly be made from glacial water or Icelandic water or something fairly pure.
Yes.
Like if you used Melbourne water, it might be fairly pure and fairly good water, but it'll have fluoride in it. It will have other,
All the other
Well, it
bits.
depends. I mean,
which may or may not interact with whatever else is in the.
Yes.
that being said, if you can get Melbourne water from the tap, which you can't often use to cut your spirits with because it's got fluoride and other additives in it. But Melbourne in itself, like Yarra Ranges, has some catchment, like fresh catchments that are not mixed. Or
Spring water,
spring water, so to speak.
distilled water.
Actually, any water that falls in Melbourne, some of it can be used,
Okay.
Yeah,
but it's not so long as it's not been treated first.
Do we know if the first two were chill filtered? Josh is asking.
I'm fairly sure George Dickel started chill. One of the only people that still chill filter.
Ah.
A lot of the people thought because they were doing an extra filtration process with Tennessee whiskey that they didn't need to chill filter. George Dickel was based on the fact that if we're going to do this extra filtration before aging it,
Yeah.
So the idea is you make the most pure spirit before putting it in the barrel to collect all of its flavour. We may as well get as much clarity out of it as possible. So they do chill filter it.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
Christina
yeah.
says, George Dickel makes me think of Tasmanian balmy nights with the smell of hay in the air and a box of fresh apricots. That sounds quite picturesque.
I think
apricots.
Apricots.
I think
Apricots.
Christine has got that bang on the money. That is like drinking it with a little bit of ice, and a nice balmy night
Yeah.
with hay in the air.
That sounds good. Yeah, do we have any last comments on sour mash? George Dickel.
I think this is a really good example of a reasonably affordable American whiskey that
Good.
doesn't need to be mixed.
No. No, you're quite right.
Mm. That's delicious.
Fantastic.
Oh.
Now, what are we moving on to now? The Rittenhouse, I believe.
Rittenhouse.
Rye.
Rye
Rittenhouse
whiskey.
Rye. Luke is very
I'm
excited.
so excited for this.
Rye
Why are you so
whiskey.
excited? What's the deal with rye whiskey?
So rye whiskey, when it comes to grain, there's something to be said about depth of flavor, complexity, all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that we talk about in whiskey is dark, rich flavors and fruit flavors and complexity and sometimes a bit of yeastiness. The brilliant thing about rye is of all the grains, it is the most flavorful by itself before you do anything to it.
Interesting.
That's why it's used to make rye bread. It's very nutritious. It's a dark, hardy, really hardcore grain.
Yeah, okay.
Apparently quite dense. But it can be very difficult to make whiskey out of. So when you add the water and start the fermentation, it can be like mixing cement. Because it's so dense and so flavorful, it sucks up all of the water and it's almost impossible to stir.
Interesting.
Rye whiskey needs to be 51% rye grain.
Yeah.
Almost nobody makes 100% rye because it's almost impossible to stir the sour mash, or the mash.
Yeah.
The highest that most people go to is about 95, and things like that. And the last 5% is wheat or barley they use to really kickstart the fermentation.
Okay.
But all of the flavour
Is the rye.
is that rye.
Do they take some of the mash from the prior batch and bring it forward?
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It is not a characteristic that they often talk about when making rye whiskey, because the reason they talk about sour mash, particularly with bourbon in Tennessee, is because you have a whole different combination of flavours from corn and barley and what have you, and they want to add flavour to it from the mash.
Yeah.
The rye whiskey brings up so much of its own flavour, it's not always necessary to do that. They do often do it so that they can kickstart that fermentation.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily the key flavour, so that's why it's not sour mash rye.
Yeah, okay. David has said Balcones 100 proof rye is 100% rye mash, and one of the very few that do it that way.
I think there's about 2 to 3 distilleries that do it.
Yeah, okay. And that's one of them. There you go.
So the interesting thing about rye is that it's drier, it's spicier,
Can it be sharp?
also has more fruit.
Okay, interesting. I feel like this one is slightly
It's
brown.
darker.
Yeah.
Brown.
And it's a darker grain.
Brown.
If you look
Brown.
at like dark rye
Brown.
bread, that's
It's
really
brown.
dark grain. Really
Yeah, okay.
dense dark grain.
Ooh.
That's brown.
Christine says, "Oh, this one smells quite spicy. Not
Yeah.
quite chocolatey, but something like a really dark, like cocoa rich."
Yeah, high percentage dark chocolate, almost that spicy, sharp cocoa
Yeah.
pepper, almost like that fragrant black pepper.
Oh, I'm gonna mispronounce this. Zuidam from the Netherlands.
Zuidam.
Zuidam from the Netherlands does a good 100% rye.
Yeah.
Says Josh.
They do.
Yes, which we sell when we can get it, which we've sold out of.
No,
Because I
we
think-
have one bottle left.
We have one bottle left. Is that the?
Anyway, beside the point.
What are you getting on the nose? I really like the colour of this one.
There's an apple that's not toasted apple or caramel apple. It's that bright acidic apple, and the acidity is coming through with that spiciness. Do you know what I mean? That
Yes.
really
That
crisp,
bite.
that crisp bite that's coming through is like peppercorns and fresh apple.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Ooh.
That's a really.
You can still like a tiny, tiny bit of vanilla, but not so much.
It's that quite fragrant vanilla, almost at risk of sounding unapproachable, Jamaican vanilla. Vanilla.
Okay. Now this one is a 50%. No, 50. ABV, am I correct?
Yes.
So slightly stronger.
And there's almost notes of ginger in there.
Ginger.
I mean, obviously the tricky things with higher ABV spirits is we traditionally don't talk about certain flavors of the whiskey that aren't actually a flavor of the whiskey, but rather the fume of the alcohol.
Yes.
So I say pepper, but I would be. It can be hard to distinguish whether or not that's a flavor or if that's just the fume.
Joshua said toffee apples.
Yeah. I'm not getting as much toffee from this.
I don't know.
Christina says, like when you take caramel to that borderline burnt level.
Yeah.
Burnt sugar's a good bet. The astringency that you get from the burnt sugar is there. It's coming through in that zesty, bright, sharp.
Colette has a chocolatey and spiced apple, almost gingerbread.
Gingerbread's a really good bet.
Yeah.
It's that really bright spice.
Yes.
And I say ginger.
Wow, on the palate it's like, woo! Too many flavours all at once.
Oh, whoa. Right on the front palate, it's like sweet pink lady apples.
Wow.
And then it goes through butter and honey.
I get that butter.
Ends in like a bit of spiciness.
Almost like shortbread, but not.
But not.
But not.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the back is
I get a multi flavour at the back.
ginger malt. Yeah, malt's a good bet.
No, I
For
do.
some reason, when you said multi-flavor, I was like, there's so like several like different flavors.
Oh,
Multi.
and you, yeah.
Ah!
No, yeah, the malt in the back
Malt
comes through.
dish.
It's a really interesting
Veronica is asking, what
on the
is the
palate.
proper way to drink whiskey to taste the flavors? Is it like wine? Do you swish it around in your mouth? Do you put it on your
The suggestion is you take a small sip and you there's a few different ways that people do it.
Okay.
The first method is you take a small sip and you leave it on the front of your tongue and you taste as many as the flavors there and the fumes fill your mouth before it covers the rest of your mouth.
Okay.
The second method is take a small sip, swish it around your whole mouth and swallow it. Don't think about it. Don't analyze it. Then when you take your second sip, your mouth is used to the amount of alcohol and you can properly assess all of the flavours from front to back.
Interesting.
And obviously you can do both. You know, have a little bit on the front, swash it back, and then do a secondary taste.
And then there's the third technique where you just go,
Woo!
Which is
Yeah,
not
yeah,
tasting
woohoo!
That's not
all
tasting.
you can taste it as crap.
Oh,
Anyway,
no,
so yeah,
no.
and the other thing is, particularly with spirits, a lot of people jump straight to the middle and back palate.
Yeah.
The front palate is really, really important because there's not a lot of sugar and sweetness in these. Putting it on the front palate where you taste fruit and sugar will really tell you a lot about the characteristics of what has happened to the grain or the spirit and the aging and the whole fermentation and distillation.
The whole shebang. Yeah. Pretty good. Christina says there's an unexpected Christmas right at the front, up front, then almost buttery melted sensation in the middle. I agree.
I enjoy that quite a lot.
That's tasty.
I think it could be a little bit more
3, 4.
buttery on the palate.
How much you want? How many drops?
5. We don't have to watch me.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it could do with a little bit more butteriness on the palate for me personally.
Yeah, okay.
But I actually think
They could do a butter wash.
Ooh, we have Liz and Rosemary approve this one.
Yeah, it's officially approved by the Liz and Rosemary Syndicate then.
a little bit of water does some really interesting things to the texture on the palate.
Yeah. Christina says there is a spicy nutmeg and cinnamon, but there is a soft vanilla sweetness on second and third sip.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Mm.
It's the longer it opens up and the longer your palate gets used to it, more of the sweetness comes through, and a little bit more of the complexity.
Now I've added water, I get a bit of grassiness.
Yeah, on the nose.
The water for me gave a lot more richness, a lot more buttery in the middle.
It's getting grassy on the nose, but.
Ooh.
Mm.
Well, we've got Adam has chimed in. This is a winner. Luke on the rocks equals perfection. Nice.
I totally agree with that, Adam.
So you're going to have some ice.
I'm going to put some ice in mine.
Okay. It almost needs the ice because it's such strong flavours. It's like so many. It's like a flavour bomb, really.
There you go.
There's a lot of whiskies that you add water to open up, and ice doesn't open up them up in the same way. I found that rye is sometimes, because it's such a spicy big whiskey, it's often made to drink on the rocks. So a bit of ice often does.
Rye is made to drink on the rocks.
A lot of the time, yeah. Oh.
Thoughts, feelings, opinions?
Floral notes come out on the nose after bringing it down to temperature a little bit.
A lot softer. Now, where do you want to be drinking this one?
Oh, the texture.
With the ice, it's now a
Summer drink.
Oh well, late afternoon drink.
Okay.
It's perfect spring weather drink, I think.
Spring weather, yeah.
This is, I think, 18 degrees, sun's been out.
And a charcuterie platter.
Ooh.
I think,
What's really interesting,
I think some smoked meats would be
the
lovely.
ice is actually
Personally.
poured out a little bit more
Or a bit of strong cheese, a bit of cheddar.
funky flavours from the fermentation on the nose. Like almost, dare I say, banana-y.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. Adam has gone, drink it anytime.
Now, and this is
Almost banana bread, in fact.
yeah, and this is not surprising. A lot of the time, if you get those higher ABV spirits, they can sometimes have what's called esters. So they're complex
They
tropical.
probably all have esters, don't they?
They all do, but you get more esters, and esters are complex fruit flavors that come from complex fermentation. So you get it a lot of the time in rum because they used a wild yeast and they let it ferment longer. So if this is a higher ABV spirit, it's often been fermented slightly longer. The yeast has turned more sugar into alcohol, which is giving it sharpness, but more yeast complexity, which is why you're getting some of those tropical fruit flavors. But it also suggests that they use a wild yeast, which is really interesting because it's not very common in America.
Colette has said, Colette and George have said, very happy with this one. I agree. And we also have made a cocktail to post on Saturday using
With
the Rittenhouse.
The Rittenhouse.
Yeah. So if you have any left over.
So if you are an avid rye drinker, you will probably know of the Sazerac cocktail. So that will be posted on Saturday.
Yeah, beautiful. Now, do we have any
You're going
last...
to post an old fashioned at some stage, Luke?
Already have.
Already have.
Already on it. Do we have any last comments on American whiskey, or do we have a favourite?
My last comment on American whiskey: if you don't like American whiskey, you haven't found the right one yet. And if you don't like what you've tasted, stop drinking bourbon and drink either a Tennessee or a rye or a more
Something
complex
else.
American whiskey. Because there's a lot of different types of American whiskey that aren't bourbon.
That's true.
You know,
And actually, that's more and more the case. That's so a bit like craft distilling in Australia, craft distilling in America is throwing up a whole lot of really interesting.
Well, there's
whiskey.
also a discussion to be had about the fact that American whiskey traditionally uses brand new oak, which is very wasteful because they can't use pre-used oak. They have to constantly make new barrels. So ecologically, it's not terribly sound.
Well, some of them are going down that same path, but not from an ecological point of view. It's just from an economic point of view. Like if you use a barrel once, if you use it 2 or 3 times, like your investment.
You get a lot more cost efficiency out of it.
Yeah, your return on investment is 3 times because you just buy the one barrel, use it 2 or 3 times or 4 times.
And granted, each whiskey that comes at each stage of that barrel life will be different. And I know a lot of the distilleries intentionally make different styles of whiskey from the life of the barrel as it goes further down the line.
Well, that's where the Scots have been for ages. We had the particular sherry oak, that was very traditional, but they bought second-hand sherry barrels from Spain or Portugal, so they'd already been used. They weren't that expensive. They already had some seasoning about them. Sometimes they rework them, sometimes they don't, and sometimes they refill them many times.
Anyway, last thoughts on American whiskey, Russ?
We do have a question from Veronica. What if anything would be appropriate to mix whiskey with other than classic cocktails? Thinking dry ginger ale?
In terms of mixing a mixed drink, ginger ale is really good. Some people often do soda. In terms of cocktails...
Oh no, but not in terms of cocktails. Other than the classic cocktails.
As in non-traditional cocktails, possibly.
Well, what about a soda?
Whiskey goes really well with, particularly American whiskey goes really well with sherries and ports. So adding a dash of sherry or port to your whiskey can be, if it's too dry or strong to be drinking on ice by itself, that can be a really good addition.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's also, if you have some sherries or ports that you otherwise wouldn't be drinking, it's a good use for them.
Yeah.
But yeah, ginger ale, soda water.
Beautiful.
Pepsi.
Oh, a really spicy,
Stuck that one in.
spicy rye whiskey goes really well with a freshly pressed green apple juice.
Well, Christina says, I want to make a refreshing Granny Smith influenced cocktail with the George Dickel.
There you go.
Yeah, beautiful.
American whiskey is great with apple juice.
And Adam has said, whiskey maple smash with soup peas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful. Well, does that take us on to next week? What are we doing next week?
Long awaited. Next week
week,
we are doing sparkling.
woo, to celebrate, because we can go further than 25 kilometres from your house.
But
And it's the
Less
Thursday
than-
before Cup Day, so we've got to
Woo!
get our bubbling gear ready for
Now,
Cup
we
Day.
couldn't do a sparkling tasting without a proper champagne.
No,
Champagne.
we could.
But we
We
could,
have.
but we decided not to.
But that would be silly.
But not for celebrating.
Okay, so we've got proper champagne.
So we've got our Yarraburn non-vintage, our DeGiorgio Lucindale, and our Pommery champagne. So 3 different styles of sparkling.
And you can get those $345 on Drinksmiths.
Yeah,
The usual goes.
beautiful.
And we're still deciding on what we're going to be doing.
The week after,
Yeah.
which should be posted probably because tomorrow's a public holiday. It will be posted next
Well,
week.
there's some ideas been kicking around here, though.
Oh, there has been.
Ooh.
But nothing to be announced yet.
It started. No,
Not-
not yet.
Secrets. Beautiful.
It's not a secret. We haven't. We've got some. There's 2 camps. Some people want one thing, and some people want another. So
And it's
We've
yet to
got
be
lots of
decided.
options.
but I
Beautiful.
won't mention tequila.
Well, fantastic. So, yeah, usual. Have a wonderful long weekend for those in Victoria. Enjoy the football.
Oh, it'll be interesting weekend, that's for sure.
Okay,
Fantastic.
a show of hands. Who's going for the Cats? Who's going for the Tigers? Oh, Cats.
I haven't
Tigers.
decided yet.
You haven't decided?
Yeah, no.
Your hair's blue.
Oh,
Ooh.
well, you're not going to make it yellow and.
I love the idea that you think the colour of my hair is football related. That is a really, really fast stretch.
Well, anyway, we
Farewell.
shall see you next
See you
week.
next week.
And bye.
Cheers. Woohoo!
Bye.